Hi, it's our pleasure to welcome you, honorable guest, Dr. Penny Goldberg, to this 8th episode of The Voice of the Expert, which is a monthly program organized by the Center of Measurement and Evaluation in Education and Development. This program takes place in a particular context marked by the appearance of a series of crises in our contemporary life, taking many forms: health, economic, social, political, environmental, etc. And of course, all the repercussions and effects that they induce at all levels. It's also a changing and evolving context, characterized by rapid global transformations and the emergence of new challenges such as knowledge explosion, technological development, and digital revolution. All of this requires seeking central and primordial position for the expert in any field. The voice of the expert program aims to highlight characteristics, interests, and contributions of experts in various fields. It also aims to find out their expectations and prospective perceptions on different topics in the fields of expertise. Today is the 8th episode of this program, in which I have the honor and the pleasure to welcome and interview our dear guest, Dr. Penny Goldberg. Thank you, Penny, for accepting the invitation.
Thank you very much for having me.
Okay, so I will start by quickly introducing our honorable guest, Dr. Penny Goldberg, who has a great CV. Penny Goldberg holds a PhD in economics from Stanford University in 1992 and a diploma in economics from Freiburg University in 1986. She is a professor of economics and an affiliate of the Economic Growth Center at Yale University. From 2018 to 2020, she was the chief economist of the World Bank Group. She was president of the Econometric Society in 2021 and has previously served as vice president of the American Economic Association. She is an applied microeconomist on questions of trade and development. She has produced numerous publications on a variety of topics like protectionism in the US, trade, poverty, and inequality, the interplay between informality and trade liberalization in the presence of labor market frictions, and discrimination against women in developing countries. Without delay, the first words for you, Dr. Penny Goldberg, before we begin to address axes of the episode. So, the interview, yes?
Yes,
Dr.
yes.
Penny?
Yes.
So the interview will be articulated around 4 axes: professional experiences and consulting activities, research interests and achievements, nature of career, future perspectives. So now we start by the first axis: professional experience and consulting activities. So the first question, Dr. Penny, you are professor of economics at Yale University.
That's right.
What tasks do you take on in this position?
Well, so Yale is a major research university, which means all professors at Yale have a dual mission, teaching and research. So what we do is we teach both undergraduate and graduate courses, and at the same time we do research. Now, teaching involves both teaching courses, so teaching classes, and doing the usual stuff, holding lectures, sections, seminars, grading, but also a lot of advising. We also advise students, and we try to mentor them throughout their trajectories. Research, as you know, is open-ended. So we are motivated by many of us by open questions in the field or by current events. And we do our best to apply the tools we have from economics in order to answer them. So broadly speaking, these are the two things you do as a professor. Of course, at the same time, you are an employee of the university, so there are many administrative tasks. You participate in running the university, in hiring decisions, in promotion decisions, and so on.
Thank you. Second question, Dr. Penny. You have held several academic positions in different universities since 1992, Princeton University, Columbia University, and Yale University. The question is, what you consider your proper best practices? So what you practice and enjoy as good in teaching, assessing students, supervising, advising students, and finally doing research.
So the job of a professor is a multifaceted job. And different people tend to specialize on different aspects of this mission. If you want, there are some people who are wonderful teachers, especially undergraduate teachers, but they spend less time on research. There are people who are great researchers, but spend less time on teaching. So within our field, within this job description that's called being a professor, there is still comparative advantage. So some people do one thing better than other. And I think one thing I like about being an academic and also about being in economics in particular is that it's multifaceted. So you can do many different things. You don't do just one thing. Personally, I've always tried to do whatever I do to do it as best as I can. So I very much believe in teaching, in being as good as one can in teaching, because this is what forms the thinking of the next generation, especially when it comes to undergraduates. So undergraduates in the United States often come to the university without having a clear idea what they want to do. And so many of them will not end up doing economics. And so it's really important to teach them the fundamental principles of economics. Many of them will go on being, lawmakers or being lawyers, or some of them end up being politicians. Some of them will be doctors. Some of them, may end up being engineers. It's all over the place. But there are some fundamental questions where I think it's really helpful to have been exposed to economics when you are confronted with them. Just to give you one example, take vaccinations. This is a very topical issue in the last few years. In the United States, at least, you often have to convince people that it makes sense for the government in some cases to mandate vaccinations. It's very hard for people to understand why this is the case unless they have been exposed to concepts such as externalities and the role that economics has to play there. So I think it's very important for academics, for professors, to try to convey, especially to undergraduates, some fundamental principles of economics. Then when it comes to graduate students, there the challenges are very different. And actually, for me personally, one of the most enjoyable aspects of my career has been advising some of the best students from all over the world. And one great thing about the United States is that we do get to see some of the best minds from all over the world. So it's truly multicultural, multi-ethnic. There are no biases, no prejudice, and you just try to push the frontier. So that has always been for me one of the best aspects of the job. And then on the research, again, the tastes differ there. Personally, I've always been motivated by policy relevant questions. This doesn't mean that an academic needs to be directly involved in policy, even though I think it's useful to be going back and forth between academia and policy. But personally, I've always been motivated by what is going on in the world. And ideally, you, as an academic, you have the luxury that you don't have a boss, you don't have to answer to a particular authority, you have freedom of speech. So you can actually try to provide answers while you search truth to the best of your ability. But ultimately, what makes an academic, I think, really happy in the long run is if they see their ideas implemented in practice. So I don't know if this answers your question, but this is roughly my thinking about practice in the field.
Okay, it's okay, Penny. We move to the third question. You were as chief economist of the World Bank Group from 2018 until 2020. If you want to describe your experience in this position at the World Bank Group.
Yes, so I entered the World Bank as chief economist, and one question people often ask is, what exactly do you do as chief economist? So your job is threefold. So first, you are the head of the research department of the World Bank, and the World Bank has a very strong research department. So in principle, you are the head of research. Now, the World Bank the research department is very independent. So people there behave like academics in an academic department. They pursue their own research. Now, this research tends to be mostly relevant to developing countries. And so as the chief economist, you oversee this research. So that's the first aspect of the job. Second, you are a high-level consultant to the president of the World Bank. So you provide advice when needed on many different issues. And third, you also provide advice to countries when countries seek this advice. And so one of the tasks that of chief economists is they tend to visit many countries. The World Bank has many local offices in many different countries, many country offices. So they tend to visit country offices, talk to the local economists there, see what the issues of interest are, and try to provide advice. My experience at the World Bank was, I would say, quite mixed. On the research side, actually, it was very interesting. Research at the World Bank is different than in academia in the sense that people are much closer to policy questions. So on the other hand, they're under a lot of pressure to answer these questions within a short period of time. In academia, sometimes we can spend years writing an academic paper, not to mention publish it. In a policy institutions, things happen much faster. You are always under pressure to give the answer today. You cannot wait for months or years. On the other hand, what you say tends to be picked up much more readily by policymakers if it's relevant to them. And because of that, you are exposed to many interesting topics, some topics that you wouldn't have thought about if you were in academia. So on the research side, I think it's a very interesting job. For me, also, one of the most enjoyable experiences was to visit the country offices. And I'm not saying that in the spirit of being a tourist where you use the opportunity to go visit other countries, but you go to other countries, you talk to policymakers or to policy experts, and you get a completely different understanding of what the challenges of each country are. And you also get often a completely different understanding of what the strengths and the weaknesses of countries are. There are countries that are really eager to get the advice of experts or the advice of economists. There are countries that really embrace the involvement of the World Bank. And by that, I don't mean that they just want loans from the World Bank. They really wanted the expert advice. And on the other hand, there are countries that completely ignore that, and that can be very frustrating. On the other hand, it's also quite interesting to be exposed to that. You see, you understand that you can only support reform if the countries are willing to buy it, and if they're not, there's not much you can do. And the interaction with the president, again, and the upper management of the World Bank, again, it's something that's very that's a new experience to an academic, because in academia you don't have a boss. So you enter the World Bank and all of a sudden you're exposed to a hierarchy that academics are not used to. All I can say is it's a very nice, it's a very nice position to be in, to always have an exit strategy. And as an academic, I was on leave from academia. I went to the World Bank. I had the luxury of being exposed to some of the best parts of the World Bank without ever feeling I was really stuck there. So overall, it was a very interesting experience, I would say.
Okay, another question. You were the first woman appointed as editor-in-chief of the American Economic Review from 2011 to 2016, one of the most prestigious journals in economics. If you can describe your experience in this position also.
Yes, so the job of the editor is one, I think, of the most important jobs in economics. You're considered to be the gatekeeper, because in order to be promoted in all universities, but especially in research universities, you need to have publications. And not every publication counts the same. People tend to put a lot of weight on what they call publications in the top 5 economics journals. And the American Economic Review is one of the top 5. So when you accept a paper for publication, then effectively you're making a decision on the person's career, right? This person is one step closer to tenure and to promotion and so on. So people think of this position as being very, very powerful, which it is, but at the same time, it's an enormous responsibility. It involves enormous work. I viewed it more as service to the profession than a power game. And it's very interesting because you get exposed to some of the best work in economics. So people tend to submit their best work to the top 5 journals. The American Economic Review was one of them. So you get to see some of the best papers from all over the world. Your power is not unconstrained. So you send papers to other co-editors, you send papers to referees, the referees provide recommendations. So it's actually a process of consultation. So the editor has a lot of power, but at the same time, you also need to hear what the referees have to say. Sometimes you need to convince the referees if you have a different opinion. So you can have a back and forth. So overall, it's a very interesting, work, but at the same time, very time consuming, and it involves an enormous responsibility, because in the end, you end up affecting people's careers. And I think no one takes that very lightly.
Okay, I have a final question for this first axis. You have won numerous of honors, awards, and prizes. If you can describe the Bodosaki Prize in Social Sciences that you received.
So the Bodosaki Prize is a prize given by the Bodosaki Foundation in Greece to, I don't like using this terminology, but that's what the prize is, to the best social scientist under 40 of Greek descent. So you don't have to be, I happen to be Greek, but you don't have to be Greek if your parents were Greek. You also qualify for this prize. And I was one of the recipients. There is one every year. Now, the reason I should point out, the reason that this is not a trivial prize is because you compete intertemporally with other fields. So it's not the case that the prize goes to an economist every year. It has to go to a social scientist, broadly interpreted. So sometimes it goes to a historian, or sometimes to someone in the law school. So it can be in many different fields. So they only give it to an economist if there is an economist. Can be a potential recipient. As I said, it's a prize given by a Greek institution. So for me, it had particular value because I'm Greek. And even though I don't live in Greece anymore, so I left Greece very early, it's always nice to be recognized by your own country.
Okay, Penny, if you have anything to add on this first axis.
I don't. You were very comprehensive. Thank you.
Okay. Now we can move to the second axis, research interests and achievements. So your research interests include various areas like international trade policies, effects and determinants, exchange rate pass-through pricing to market and international price discrimination, distributional effects of trade liberalization, other topics in applied macroeconomics. So we will discuss each of these areas in depth to know the topics of the subject studied and the main contributions and achievements you have done. For example, the first question concerning the area of international trade, what are the research questions studied and what are the main results that you found?
So this is by far my main area of research. So there have been many different lines of work. When I started as an academic economist, so when I was writing my PhD, the main question of interest was what people call the strategic trade policy. And the idea was that there is the following. In general, economists tend to advocate free trade. They tend to believe low tariffs, few trade restrictions are best for the economy. However, there may be exceptions. And one such exception is if you think that there are profits, that firms make big profits, then there might be an incentive for a country to engage trade policy in such a way to bring the profits home. So one good example was the competition between Boeing and Airbus. These are very profitable companies, and the United States had every incentive to support Boeing, and Europe had every incentive to support Airbus. Why? Because both firms were profitable, and each country felt that, or each country group felt that by supporting its own firms, it would shift the profits to their own economy. So that was the big issue when I was writing my PhD, and this issue was also discussed in the United States in the context of their competition with Japan. So Japan, at the time, so this was late 80s, early 90s, Japan was viewed the same way China is viewed today, an emerging power who was going to take over the whole world. Their market was relatively closed. The US market was open to Japanese imports. And there was a lot of concern in the United States about the imports coming from Japan. So my early work focused, as a result of all these considerations, it focused mostly on the automobile industry in the United States and the way trade restrictions affecting the automobile industry, the way these restrictions were affecting the whole economy. So as a result, I ended up working for a few years, mostly on topics related to autos. So my research ended up being more industrial organization than pure trade. In order to address the relevant questions, I had to develop a model of the industry, an empirical model of the industry, of how it works. then estimate the model using available data, and then examine what's the impact of various restrictions, like if you have quotas, what happens then. And at the same time, you see what the impacts of various exchange rate changes were. You mentioned also exchange rates before. Exchange rate also had a very big impact on trade between countries. And so that was my early research. Then in the 90s, my focus shifted towards, from the United States, towards what was going on in developing countries with trade, and especially at the time in Latin America. And the motivation for that was that many countries had decided to unilaterally liberalize their trade regime. So many countries in Latin America reduced tariffs drastically. This was partly because they were entering the World Trade Organization. And so a very natural question was, how did this affect their economy? What were the impacts? A good part of my research at the time focused on the impacts on inequality. So at the same time, we witnessed both in the United States and in Europe, but also in many countries in the developing world, an increase in inequality, income inequality, wage inequality. And one natural question was this due to trade liberalizations or not? So a very large part of my research focused on this question using microdata, just examining the effect that tariff reductions had on inequality in these countries. And there are good theoretical reasons to believe that trade can impact inequality. This is what trade models teach us. But in the end, after many years of empirical work, what many of us found, is that it was very hard to make the case that trade liberalization was the primary driver of inequality. There were other factors that seemed more important, like skill bias, technological change. Trade still had an effect, but to the extent it had an effect, it was always in interaction with technology. So it was technological change that seemed to be the main culprit. And we came at this conclusion by looking at the problem from many different angles, using different data sets, using many different countries. As you probably know, in economics, it's hard to agree on anything, but I think it's fair to say that by the end of the 90s, there was consensus in the academic community, in the economics community more generally, that while inequality had increased substantially in the United States and in the UK and in some countries in Europe, trade was not the primary driver there. And then I moved towards doing some work on India. A lot of my work there focused on a very different kind of trade policy, which is not trade policy per se, but the reason I mention it is because it was part of the agenda of the World Trade Organization. And this was the so-called TRIPS agreement. TRIPS stands for Trade-Related Intellectual Property Rights Protection. And the idea there was that if a country wanted to join the international trade system and enjoy the low tariffs that other countries enjoyed, then it had to adhere to the same system of intellectual property rights protection that developed countries have. So, for example, recognize patents in all sectors, including pharmaceuticals. And that ended up being a very controversial measure. I think it's fair to say that it found no support from economists, either theorists or empirical economists. My research was on the empirics, so I focused on the pharmaceutical sector, in particular in India, asking the question, what would happen if TRIPS were enforced in India? To give you some background, India is one of the few countries that had a very developed pharmaceutical sector. India and Brazil are the two countries who have their own domestic industry, a very developed domestic industry. But a lot of the products they were producing were generics, were imitations of products that had been produced, that had been introduced in the market by big pharmaceutical multinationals. And the reason these companies were so successful, the Brazilian or the Indian companies, is they were not adhering to patents. They were not respecting patents. They were just producing the same products domestically, the generic versions. So the question, one question that people asked is what is going to happen when these countries are obliged to respect patents like all other countries do. And the expectation, the general expectation, is that in that case, they will stop producing these products domestically. They will have to import them from abroad. They will have to get them from other countries, and then the prices will go up. And one thing that my research showed is that this particular concern was misguided, and the reason for that is there were price controls in India, and because there were price controls, the prices were not going to go up. However, precisely because there were price controls, the multinationals would never enter India. So actually the real problem is that people in India would never have access to these medicines simply because there was no incentive for big companies to sell to India in the presence of price control. So you couldn't have it both ways. Either there wouldn't be price controls and the prices would be high, and then the companies would have an incentive to enter the market, but then almost no one would be able to afford them, or you would have price controls, which seems more appropriate for a low-income country. But then in that case, there would be no incentive for the companies to enter the market. So there was a big problem, but the problem was not really the problem of price. And so I argued at the time for other measures like compulsory licensing. And these issues became relevant again during the COVID time, where there was a big debate as to whether we should allow countries, developing countries, to put up their own facilities to produce vaccines for COVID. So that all this had much more to do with intellectual property rights protection, but as I said, because it was part of the World Trade Organization's agenda, it ended up being very relevant to trade policy discussions. And finally, so more recently, I have been focusing on what we call the informal sector in developing countries, and how this is affected by trade. And by the informal sector, we mean the part of the economy that's invisible to the government. You can measure it in terms of firms that are not registered and don't pay taxes, or in terms of labor that's off the books. And as you probably know, this is a huge issue in most middle and low income countries. It's not a big issue in high income countries. It has very important implications for taxation, for tax revenue, but also it has important implications for efficiency. In order to be informal, firms need to stay small. Small firms don't enjoy economies of scale, so they're often less efficient. It may also have implications for the quality of work. People who are employed informally, they don't have any security, they don't have a safety net, they don't have access to benefits. But at the same time, they may have more flexibility. So in general, in most countries, the informality is considered an undesirable phenomenon. And one question that my research has tried to address recently is, so what happens if you have a developing country, a developing economy, and then you open up to trade, you open up to international markets? What does this do to informality? And the answer is it's very mixed, actually. It's in the manufacturing sector, in the tradable sector, you would expect to see a decrease in informality. But then in the service sector, you may see an increase in informality. So in the end, you may not see a clear effect on informality at all. And this is very much consistent with experience. And then we'll go on to examine potentially better responses to addressing informality than enforcing it, than auditing firms or imposing penalties. This is just a brief overview.
Okay. Thank you, Penny. Interesting description of your research activities. We can make a zoom to another area of industrial organization. same question. What are the research topics studied, and what are the main results that you found?
So a lot of my work on trade ended up being actually at the intersection of trade and industrial organization. So I already mentioned my work on the automobile industry. And in order to answer how trade policies were affecting the automobile industry, I had to develop a model of the automobile industry. A lot of the work in industrial organization has had the same agenda in the sense of people trying to focus on particular industries and develop models of these industries. Similarly, my work on intellectual property rights protection was focused on the pharmaceutical sector. And again, I had to develop a model of the pharmaceutical sector. What I mean by model is you model the forces that shape demand, the forces that shape supply. Usually supply, what makes it interesting is you don't have perfect competition. You have a few firms that dominate the market. In the case of the automobile industry, you had an oligopoly, very few, about 10, 15 firms that compete internationally. Some of them are domestic and some of them are foreign. So there's a lot of international competition. In the case of the pharmaceutical sector, of course, you have a few big multinationals that dominate the picture. But as I mentioned, one thing that's very interesting if you are interested in developing countries is you also had domestic production in some countries, such as India and Brazil. You also had domestic production. And some of these firms were very big and successful, but some of these firms were small. And it's an interesting question, how do we deal with these firms? I mean, I would claim actually that India provides one of the best examples of successful industrial policy. They really nurture their pharmaceutical sector. And as a result, it developed to be a major power. These are the two main industries that I have focused on and which have been relevant to industrial organization. Another interesting question, where again I drew on industrial organization methods to answer it, has to do with exchange rates. And there the question is the following. So there is a lot of exchange rate volatility. We see exchange rates changing all the time. But then the prices of imported products tend to remain stable in the local currency. And again, cars were the primary example in the United States. So in the 80s and 90s, there was a lot of exchange rate volatility. You would expect the prices of cars sold in the United States to change in response to the exchange rates, but actually in reality, they stayed almost the same. And what this meant is that you end up with big price differences between the United States and Europe. Even within Europe, before Europe adopted the euro, you had big differences across countries. So for example, in the United Kingdom, cars would be much more expensive than in France. And then even in continental Europe, cars in Belgium would be much cheaper than in Germany. And this seemed very, very surprising because it's not that, if you compare Belgium and Germany, they're two countries that are pretty similar in terms of demographics. They're close to each other. Why are prices of cars so different? And the answer had a lot to do with exchange rates, that every time the exchange rate changed, the local price did not change. As a result, you end up with big differences in prices. And the European Commission at the time had started many investigations of this phenomenon. And so what I've done in my work is try to, again, use the model of the automobile industry to explain why we were seeing this phenomenon, why it was the case that the local producers, the local importers were not adjusting the price. And the answer, just to get straight to the results, the answer was a mix of two main explanations. First, these companies adjusted their markups. The market conditions were such that if you were confronted with an exchange rate change such that you had to increase the price of a car, many companies found it better to increase the price, but not by the full amount. In some cases, even to let the price unchanged, which meant they had to take a decrease in their profits. And vice versa, if the conditions were more favorable and they were supposed to, and if they had responded fully to exchange rates, then they would have reduced the price of the car. In some cases, they didn't reduce it, and as a result, their profit margins increased. So there was a lot of variation in markups or profit margins. So that's one explanation. And the other explanation had to do a lot with the so-called internalization of production. So we used to think that the car that's produced in Germany is produced in Germany with German inputs. In reality, these days, it's produced with parts that come from all over the world. Most importantly, when you produce a car, you use energy, right? You use oil, and oil is priced in dollars. So if you take that into account, if you take into account the fact that actually only a relatively small part of the production occurs in the country where the company is headquartered, then exchange rates, the role of exchange rates becomes much more involved because you are exposed to exchange rates across the entire world. And it's not this very simple relationship that people had in mind between the exchange rates in the source country and the destination country. This simple relationship doesn't hold anymore.
Okay, Penny, another topic that I found in your publication concerns the determinants of incomplete exchange rate pass-through. If you can,
yeah, that's exactly what I was talking about. So incomplete exchange rate pass-through means exactly that the exchange rate changes.
Yes.
But the prices do not respond completely. You keep the prices constant, right?
Okay. Okay. Another question. You have studied various topics related to applied microeconomics. First, if you explain the domain of applied macroeconomics and what are the research questions studied by you and what are the main results that you found?
So applied microeconomics is a very general area. So pretty much everything I talked about falls within this field that we call applied microeconomics. And the idea, micro, in general means you focus on individual agents of the economy. So you focus on the households and the firms, and very often government agents, as opposed to macroeconomics, where you focus on aggregates. So you focus on inflation or growth and so on. And as I always like to tell my students, that these days micro is the foundation for macro. So before you get to the aggregates, you have to understand how individual agents behave and what the relevant relationships are there. But my own area of specialization focuses on micro. It may have implications for macro, but I focus on micro. And within micro, again, there is a distinction between more theoretical work where people develop theoretical models and more applied work where you apply these models to specific questions, or you use data to provide empirical estimates. So that's what I mean by applied micro. So my work has mostly focused on firms and households, individual agents, and it focused on applied questions. It's also empirical, so I use data and empirical methods to answer these questions. And so some examples, early on I did some work on price discrimination. And again, that's work that came out of my interest in the automobile industry. At the time, there were allegations that women and African Americans paid more for exactly the same type of car than white males in the United States. That was in the 80s, late 80s, early 90s. And the evidence was very credible because people used randomized experiments. They used, audit studies to study this phenomenon. So they would send pairs of auditors to different dealerships. One of the auditors would be a white male. The other audit, the other person would be a woman or perhaps an African American, and then they would negotiate for exactly the same car, and they would get consistently, they would get very different quotes from the dealers. And so I actually looked at the same question using data rather than this audit methodology. And then in the data, actually, you couldn't detect big differences in the prices that different groups paid. So the intent to discriminate was clearly there, given the results of audit studies, but you actually couldn't see in the data. So I've done some work on that, and basically one explanation is that people are aware of this, and then they adjust their behavior. So for example, if you're a woman and you need to buy a car, you go with a male, you go with a male friend, or with your spouse or with your male partner, rather than going by yourself to negotiate the price of a car, because you know how they're going to behave. And similarly, what we showed is for African Americans, there was really a bimodal distribution. Some African Americans paid much, much more, and some African Americans paid much less. And again, you can imagine cases where if you're aware that they're going to discriminate against you, then you try to adjust your behavior to pretend that you don't have the ability to pay to get a lower price. So, I think what was interesting about these results is to show that it's very often the case that there is discrimination, but you don't see it in the data. And the reason is that people adjust their behavior, which doesn't mean that the discrimination does not exist, but it does mean that people find ways around it. So that was one line of work. Then I've done some work on CAFE standards. That's a form that was a regulation in the United States. I don't think it's relevant to other countries, that had the objective of reducing emissions in the car fleet. Again, it was very controversial because it was a command and control regulation, the type of regulation that economists in general do not like. So I've done some work on, and it had also implications for the competitiveness of these companies. And then I've done some other work that started when I entered the World Bank that is not related to trade. The two big projects there, I would say, are one on gender, especially in developing countries, so gender discrimination in developing countries. And the other one was on human capital in developing countries. And this is really work that was not part of my original research agenda, but I became very interested in these issues when I was at the World Bank, because you realize these are first order issues, especially if you're dealing with developing countries.
Okay, Penny, the last question concerns the tools to make research. So we know that to deal with and explore the topics of applied microeconomics, quantitative methods and techniques are used. Different questions. What kind of quantitative tools did you use in your research? And are these tools sufficient to solve the problems that exist? What is your opinion on the theoretical advancement of knowledge and the development of tools of application and modeling?
That's a very interesting question and very open-ended. So personally, I've always been open to different methodologies. I think in social sciences, it's misguided to be dogmatic about approach, about method. There are people who think there's only one way of doing things. I think this is too narrow-minded given the complexity of the questions we face. I feel that my own comparative advantage has always been in doing empirical work that's grounded, that's guided by a theoretical framework. So, but that doesn't mean that I don't have respect for people who do a different style of work. So I would say that all my work has been empirical, so it always uses data. I personally, there are many people these days who use randomized trials RCTs, as randomized controlled trials. These were inspired by the success of these trials in medicine. And so, as you know, there has been a big movement in using the same in the social sciences and especially in economics. And I think that has been very successful. I haven't used it personally, not because I don't believe in it, but because it was less suited to the kind of questions that I've studied. So, for example, if you study a trade policy or intellectual property rights, it's impossible to randomize. You cannot say some countries are going to get tariffs, some other countries are not going to get tariffs. Or, you know, we are going to impose intellectual property rights laws to some countries like, you know, Brazil, but we're not going to impose them to India. You don't have the room for conducting this type of experiments, which you can do when you study other types of questions. For example, if you have an educational intervention or a health intervention, right? If you want to know, does it help to distribute textbooks to students in a developing country? Does this improve their scores? Then you can randomize. You can conduct a randomized control trial. If you study more questions where there is a market response, such as trade, that is much harder to do. So I haven't used those in my research, but I do believe they're very useful. In general, there are also, I use data, I use existing data sets. For the most part, large micro data sets. I've used both household data and also firm level data. And the fact is, you learn a lot from just looking at this data. At the same time, I'm not the kind of person who just takes a data set and just provides descriptive statistics. Again, I think there's enormous value to doing this, and I think there are people who do it very well. I think my comparative advantage has always been in bringing a particular conceptual framework to the questions I'm studying. So, for example, let's say you study intellectual rights protection. What is demand? What is supply in this market? What, based on the framework you have developed, what you would expect the effects to be? And this is something that guides you as to where to look, what kind of effects you should be looking at. And it also guides measurement. We often think that it's trivial to measure things, and of course, you know, in many cases, you can do a much better job in measuring if you get better data. But at the same time, one thing you realize if you worked for long enough in the field is no matter how much data you collect, you never solve the measurement challenge. Ultimately, you need to bring a certain conceptual framework to solve measurement challenges.
Okay, Penny. If you want to add more about your research topics or your main contributions before
I can, you know, I'm a professor. I like to profess. I can talk forever about my own research, but this would probably bore your audience. So I can.
Okay, so we started the third axis, the nature of experts' path. How was the academic and the professional road, a road of flowers or a road with obstacles and difficulties? So the first question, let's start with the positive. We know that the success factors are diverse and quite numerous. Some are intrinsic and others are extrinsic. What are the most important success factors that help it to create your academic or professional path?
I would say you asked about external factors, or?
Yes.
I would say it very much depends on the time we live in. There are times when there is demand for experts that people value. By experts here, I mean experts in the social sciences in particular, but I think the point is more generally applicable. There are times when people have faith in experts and they have faith in science and they seek the advice of experts and scientists. And there are times when there is more skepticism, and unfortunately, I think we live at a time where there is a lot of skepticism. There has been a lot of disappointment with some of the advice people have gotten from experts. And we've seen people growing more and more suspicious of anything that experts say, and not just social scientists, also, physical scientists. When it comes to climate change or when it comes to medicine, there's always a questioning of experts. And I view that as an external factor, in the sense that as an individual, there is very little you can do about that. At the same time, I think perhaps we also need to face to the fact that we made mistakes. And perhaps the reason people feel this way, or policymakers feel this way, has a little to do with our past behavior as well.
Now, if any negative in your career, are there any difficulties, problems, or obstacles that have negatively affected your academic or professional path?
I would say in general, I consider myself extremely lucky. And I'm grateful for my luck. My luck started with the fact that as a woman, I was born in the 20th century in a country that was not rich, but was not very poor either. A country that was growing, to a loving family. I've had it better than most people, and I'm very grateful for that. And I always keep that in mind, so I have no complaints. But I think in everyone's life there are ups and downs. There are sometimes things go well, and sometimes they don't. And ultimately, people tend to see the successes and they don't know the failures. I mean, I think in my case, I've had many opportunities that I took advantage of, but these opportunities also presented challenges. Just to give you an example, I grew up in Greece. I left Greece when I was 17 to go to Germany. I studied in Germany economics. That was a great opportunity. I was exposed to a different country, a different language, a different way of thinking. I got a very good education. But at the same time, I was 17 in a very different country. So it was a very different experience. It was challenging. And then I left Germany, I came to the United States. So that was another major change. I think this is something that everyone who has moved across countries has experienced. And again, I've had the good luck of moving across countries as a skilled migrant. So I have no complaints. So whatever challenges I faced, they don't compare to the challenges that other people face who flee wars or persecution and who knows what. But nevertheless, it still gives you some sense of what it is to leave your country behind, to leave your culture behind, and face a very different environment. You always have to adjust, and you have to be willing to learn and to adjust, and that's great and exhilarating, but it can also be challenging.
Okay, Penny, the final question that I asked to everyone, to every expert, are there any personal failures or mistakes in your academic or professional path?
Oh, there are many. There are so many. I don't think I made a fatal mistake. I cannot think of something that, destroyed my life, or but down the road, I surely made many. I think part of the difficulty I faced is I don't come from an academic family. I mean, my parents value education. They were highly educated. They valued education and academic achievement very much, but they were not academics. And they also had no connections to the United States. So I had to figure out everything completely on my own. So you very often you don't know how to navigate the profession. You finish your PhD thesis, you write papers, you don't know where to submit them, to what journals. You don't know how to interact professionally sometimes, how to behave towards other colleagues. So I try to actually, now that I'm more experienced and I'm more senior, I try to provide this advice to my younger colleagues, to those who enter the field now. And that's part of the mentoring we do. You know, we do it for our students and we do it for the younger faculty. But yes, surely I made mistakes, and as I said, nothing that I would consider to be fatal. But there are situations that I could certainly have handled better.
Okay. Now we start the first axis, perceptions and projections towards the future. The first question, Penny, what are the contributions that you consider the significant and the most important of your academic career in terms of teaching or research or consulting, which you defend each time and which can be put in place for use, different use?
So I think on the research side, I've done a lot of research on the effects of trade policies, both on the motivations for trade policies, but also on their effects on developing countries, mostly on developing countries. I would say I don't like to praise my own work, but I would say one of the main contributions is I try to employ techniques that made these results credible, that they were not motivated by ideology or dogma, but rather by using the best available methods. And as I mentioned earlier, I think this work did speak to some important issues we faced and we still face today, for example, regarding inequality. And one of the insights of this work was that, at least in the 90s, prior to 2000, 2010, it was very hard, based on the existing evidence, it was very hard to argue that trade had been the main culprit behind the increase in inequality. This changed more recently, but for other reasons, mainly the focus on spatial inequality. Another contribution, I would say, that applies to every academic, is through the many students I've created. And as I mentioned before, that's one of the, I think, of the most pleasant and perhaps most important parts of our job, that you produce scholars who are going to take the baton from you and do good work in the future. And I've had the good luck and I've had the privilege of working with some wonderful people who are in great places today and do very good work. And finally, I would say also when I was at the World Bank, I think I worked on a few projects that I view as quite important. One was the World Development Report that was on global value chains, and that ended up being, the importance of global value chains to global trade and global welfare has become a central issue recently. And then my work on human capital and also the work on gender equality in the World Bank. I don't mean to say that I was the only one working on these issues, not at all. Actually, when I entered the World Bank, there were already groups working on these issues. But I hope that my presence and my support actually helped move this, help make these issues central in research and the work of the World Bank.
Okay, second question. Do you have any outstanding or open question problem that has not yet been addressed in the field of applied microeconomics or otherwise?
Oh, many. I mean, the field of economics is full. Economics has wonderful questions, many very interesting questions. We tend to have few answers, at least few answers that withstand the test of time, partly because things change all the time. I think one of the most interesting questions right now is the future of globalization and the future of international peace. I think we're at a very important turning point. And what is going to happen in the future is completely unknown. We can try to bring research thinking. We can try to bring research to the table and the accumulated wisdom of the past, but still there are so many parameters that are very hard to figure out. I think we live at a fascinating time right now.
Mm-hmm. Okay, some projection for the future. One question, what are the long-term financial and economic consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic and of the war between Russia and Ukraine, and also the current tensions between the West and Russia?
In short, I think they are very important. I do not believe that COVID was a game changer for most countries. COVID accelerated many pre-existing trends. So one of them was the adoption of technology or remote work. So people were using, let's say, online platforms to shop already. But during COVID, almost everyone switched from going to the supermarket or going to the local store to shopping online. Many people wanted to work from home at least once a week. During COVID, this became the norm. People started working much more from home. So these trends were already there, but during COVID, they were accelerated. And what we see post-COVID is that some of these norms have changed for good. And I'm not sure, I think this applies to the whole world, but definitely in the United States, there is much more remote work than it used to be. This is something that people demand these days, people really want. Not everyone, there is enormous heterogeneity, but this is something that's in very high demand and employers need to provide it to people. I think this is going to have very important implications for gender issues, because on one hand, it allows women to work from home, especially when they have families. And the truth is, the fact is that still women bear the burden of family, of raising a family, or of taking care of the elderly when their parents get older. So it's going to have, so we'll see how these issues are handled in the future. I think they're going to have implications for gender, but they're going to have very important implications for the future of cities, because people used to come to the cities to work. Now you can work remotely from anywhere. You can choose a much cheaper place to live, which means the future of cities is very uncertain. I think actually I would say this is a trend that is very specific to COVID. I never anticipated the decline of cities, at least not in the United States, but with COVID, this is something that one needs to be seriously worried about. But other than that, I think if Ukraine had not happened, if China, if the tensions with China were not there, I would say that COVID would have accelerated these pre-existing trends, but eventually we would have returned to normal. Perhaps doing some things better than before. There would be many challenges. There would be fiscal challenges. There is debt in developing countries. And so on, but I think we were on a good path to solve all these challenges. I think the war in Ukraine, to me, that was a real game changer that has changed things for good. And this is because one of the reasons that we enjoyed growth and an increase in prosperity in the last 30 years is we had peace internationally. And again, I'm saying that being fully aware of the fact that we didn't have peace everywhere. There were still many wars all over the world. But at least in the West, in the United States and in Europe, there was peace in very large parts of high-income countries. There was peace, and that allowed, that accounts for many good things that happened, including the fact that we had, again, here the opinions may vary, but my own opinion is that this globalization trend, the internalization of production, this allowed countries to prosper. It allowed for much faster growth, especially in Asia. And even though it did create big inequalities, it did benefit the average person and the average consumer very much. So we had all these positive developments in the last 30 years, but now we're entering a period where there is war, there is an energy crisis, there is certainly war in energy. As a result, Russia has been cut off from world markets. Most importantly, apart from the direct effects of the conflict, there was the realization that trade or internalization implies dependence, and this dependence can be very problematic if you don't have a peaceful relationship. So now Europe is dependent on Russia for energy, and they're facing many challenges in the near future. So the thinking in the United States changed by realizing that we have many dependencies these days on countries from which we import, such as China, but also countries where our production facilities are located, and that applies to many other Asian countries. So that has led people to completely rethink globalization, global value chains, the internalization of production. So you asked me before what are interesting research questions. I think these are all questions for the future. What do all these challenges imply for the future of globalization and for the future of international production? And personally there, my personal view is that if we continue on this path, the years ahead are going to be years of much lower growth and less prosperity than the years of the past. So I'm not too optimistic about the future.
Okay, Penny, another projection to seek what will be the future of consumption of goods and products, investment and inflation.
Inflation is a very big issue right now. Again, in the absence of the war in Ukraine, I thought it's something that could have been reigned. Right now, I think things are very uncertain. And this is partly because it's not the case that the war created inflation. You know, the inflationary pressures were there in the aftermath of COVID. But as COVID was winding down, we were on a good path, at least in the United States, to tame inflation. I do think that the war has been a game changer. You know, it directly contributed to higher energy prices and food prices, especially in European countries. But more than that, it has created enormous uncertainty and changing expectations. So that in turn, as I said before, that in turn has completely changed the thinking about international trade, about where the production of goods should take place. There is much more demand for onshoring, for bringing production to the domestic country. That it's easy to say, but it's almost impossible to implement. There is, at least not in the short or medium run, it's impossible to bring production back to the United States. So an alternative is what people call friendshoring. You conduct trade, you have close economic relationships, but only with your friends, not with your enemies. But that requires one to take a stand as to who your friends are and who your enemies. And as we know, this can change. This changes from year to year. So, and if the United States were to trade only with Europe, that would not solve many of the issues we face right now. Many of the goods we consume now come from developing countries, especially Asia. Semiconductors, one of the hottest, the most debated product categories. The production of semiconductors is fragmented and happens in several countries, most of which are again in Asia, in Taiwan, in Korea, in China. Who is our friend here and who is not? It's not very clear. And so one challenge is that a lot of these issues are political in nature. They don't depend on economists. Who your friends are, who your enemies, that doesn't depend on economist or an economic research, this is completely external to an economist. And depending on what the political developments of the next few years are, the projections for trade or inflation may be very different. If you asked me, a year and a half ago, what I thought about inflation or trade, that would be completely different prior to Ukraine and the trade war with China than it is now.
Okay, Penny, now we return to our job at the university. You know that the context today is very particular, characterized mainly by the knowledge explosion and the digital revolution. All this will expand and will develop in the future. So the question is, what will be the future of education, teaching, and learning?
So that again is a very big and open question. I think there is consensus in my view that there will be demand for higher skills across all levels, but at the same time, not any skill. So you can be very skilled and be educated in the classics, but which may be wonderful for you as a person, but unfortunately there is very little demand for it. So there is particular demand for technical knowledge and also for certain behavioral traits, what people call socio-behavioral skills, socio-emotional skills. So, for example, the ability to work in big teams, the ability to be flexible, to adjust to changing circumstances. And you can say to a certain extent, these skills may be innate, but to a very large extent, these skills can also be taught. So, for example, people always point out that the American system, the educational system in the US, is very good in developing these socio-emotional skills because the student is given a lot of independence. There's not a fixed curriculum. Very often they throw things at you, and you need to figure out what to take, what to ignore, how to learn. So pretty much students starting in middle school, they start behaving the way PhD students behave in other countries. And so I think there is a consensus that education is moving more and more towards this regime where you have to figure out yourself how to learn, and you always remain a student. You have to constantly adjust, you have to constantly learn. So I would say this is, if you're an academic, that's what you do all the time. I mean, you remain a student throughout your life. You learn from your students, and it's never the case that you actually know the answer to a problem. So you try to study a problem, and then the reality, life throws a problem at you, and then you need to figure out how to answer it. And in the process, you may develop new models, new methods, new techniques. You figure out the data. I think the way education is developing right now is people are asked to do the same at many different levels and much earlier. So before you get your PhD, as I said, perhaps even in high school. So that is going to fundamentally change the nature of education. Other changes are online learning has become much more important. Also, there has been, I think that's a positive, a certain democratization of learning. You have access to all kinds of resources through the internet. So if you know where to look, then you can actually learn a lot from the internet, from online resources. Of course, the main issue, the main problem is how do you know where to look? Right? There are people who may have an advantage there if your parents are educated. If you grow up in an environment that's very stimulating, then you may know where to look, where to search. While if you grow up in a desert, in an intellectual desert, you may be cut off from all these resources. But in principle, I think online technology could be a force for good if we actually manage to harness it.
Okay, and the final question, what are your ambitions and future plans?
So the short-run ambitions are to finish some papers I'm working on, to finish the revisions and publish the papers. Then I'm also, at Yale, we're studying a policy school. It's called the Jackson School of Public Affairs. It's a new policy school. So I have moved half my appointment from the economics department to the policy school. So in the next couple of years, I will be spending a lot of time helping the Jackson School take off in the sense of developing new courses, teaching the students there, and so on. And in general, in terms of research, I'm very interested in this question. I just mentioned what's the future of globalization. Where are we going? I think there are many unanswered questions there. And I very much hope that experts and economists will have a say, even though we live at a time where experts in general are dismissed. I still believe that it's a time where we could potentially provide very useful inputs.
So, Penny, if you have any ending words before close the episode.
No, I just want to thank you again for inviting me for this very interesting podcast. And if your audience has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Penny. So we are now coming to the end of the episode 8 of the Voice of the Expert program, in which we had the honor of inviting our dear guest, Dr. Penny Goldberg. Thank you, Penny, for having responded favorably to the invitation and for having further discussion between us by giving varied information from your academic and professional path. All the luck and success for your future academic and professional activities. Thank you again and goodbye.
Thank you very much again. It was a pleasure.